The crack of a distant gunshot tore through the quiet evening air as Madeline Barrett hastily locked the door of her small apothecary shop in the heart of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory. 1876. She had built a life here over the past 3 years, carefully crafting remedies and tending to the townspeople's ailments. But nothing had prepared her for the night a bloodied stranger would stumble through her back door and change everything. Madeline was arranging dried herbs when the pounding at her back entrance startled her. The shop had closed an hour ago, the sun already dipping below the distant mountains. She grabbed the small revolver her father had insisted she keep and approached cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please," came a strained male voice. "I need help." Something in the desperation of those words compelled her to unlock the door. The man nearly fell into her shop, his tall frame slumping against the doorframe. Blood covered his shirt, his hands dark with it. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but she could see he was fighting to remain conscious. "Good Lord," Madeline whispered, quickly helping him inside and locking the door behind them. "What happened to you? Got into?" "A disagreement," he managed, his voice deep despite the obvious pain. He tried to stand straighter, revealing striking blue eyes beneath his hat. "Name's Fletcher Morgan. Folks call me Fletch." "I'm Madeline Barrett," she replied automatically, guiding him to a chair in her back room. "I run the apothecary. Now sit before you fall." He complied without argument, which told her how weak he truly was. When he finally removed his hat, she saw a handsome face despite the dirt and blood's strong jawline, days of stubble, and those intense blue eyes that seemed to look straight through her. "Where are you hurt?" she asked, already gathering supplies. "Not all mine," he said, nodding toward his blood-soaked hands. "But I took a bullet to the side." Madeline worked quickly, cutting away his shirt to reveal a nasty wound on his left side. The bullet had grazed him, deep enough to be serious but not immediately fatal. His hands, however, were caked in dried blood far more than his wound could account for. "You've been in a fight," she observed, cleaning his wound with practiced hands. "A bad one." Fletcher's lips tightened. "The Blackwell Gang. They've been terrorizing ranchers north of here. Today they decided to raid the Dawson place." His voice hardened. "There was a family there, children." Madeline's hands stilled momentarily. The Blackwell Gang's reputation preceded them ruthless outlaws who'd been growing bolder with each passing month. "You confronted them alone." "Someone had to," he said simply. As she worked on his wound, she couldn't help but notice the calluses on his hands, working hands, not unlike her father's had been. But there was something else about him, a quiet intensity that spoke of a man who'd seen more than his share of hardship. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked, applying a poultice of herbs to his side. "Got a small spread about 10 miles north," he replied. "Nothing fancy, just me and some cattle." Once his side was properly bandaged, she turned her attention to his hands. They were strong hands, capable, but now covered in blood, some his, most belonging to others. She filled a basin with warm water and added a few drops of lavender oil. "Give me your hands," she said softly. Fletcher extended them reluctantly, and she was struck by the gentleness with which he allowed her to take them in hers. She began to wash away the blood, layer by layer, revealing the skin beneath. "They'll never come clean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a haunted look crossing his features. Madeline looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "They already are," she said with quiet certainty, continuing to wash away the blood with careful strokes. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was prepared to acknowledge. "You've done this before," he observed as she worked. "Patched up men like me." "I was a nurse during the war," she replied, memories flashing behind her eyes. "Saw more blood than any person should in a lifetime," Fletcher nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "You're good at it." "I'd prefer not to be needed for such things," she said honestly, "but here we are." As she finished cleaning his hands, The distant sound of horses approaching made them both tense. Fletcher was on his feet in an instant, ignoring the pain in his side as he reached for his gun. "Stay back," he warned, moving to the window to peer out cautiously. "It's just Sheriff Holloway," Madeline said with relief, recognizing the familiar silhouette. "He makes rounds this time of evening." Fletcher relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his weapon. "I should go." "Bringing trouble to your door isn't how I plan to introduce myself to the prettiest woman in Redemption Creek." The compliment caught her off guard, bringing unexpected heat to her cheeks. "You're in no condition to ride," she said firmly. "I have a small room upstairs." "You can rest there tonight." He studied her face. "Why would you help a stranger covered in blood?" "Because I've seen enough men die," she answered honestly. "And something tells me you're worth saving, Fletcher Morgan." That was the beginning the night when Madeline Barrett's carefully ordered life in Redemption Creek first intersected with Fletcher Morgan's. Neither could have predicted how their paths would continue to entwine in the months that followed, nor the dangers that awaited them both. The next morning, Madeline woke to the scent of coffee brewing. She found Fletcher in her small kitchen, moving carefully but looking considerably better than he had the night before. "You should be resting," she admonished, tying her robe tighter around her waist. "Been up since dawn," he replied, pouring her a cup. "Old habits," she accepted the coffee gratefully. "Your side, sore, but your medicine worked wonders." His eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. "I owe you a debt, Miss Barrett," Madeline, she corrected, "and there's no debt between us." "There is to my mind," he insisted. "I don't forget those who help me." After a simple breakfast, Fletcher prepared to leave, despite her protests that he should rest longer. "The Blackwell Gang won't stop," he explained, checking his revolver with practiced ease. "What happened yesterday was just the beginning. They've got their sights on controlling the whole territory." "And you plan to stop them single-handedly?" she asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. His expression softened. "No, but I aim to warn the other ranchers." "Organize some resistance." As he mounted his horse outside her back door, he tipped his hat to her. "I'll be back to check on you if that's all right." "I can take care of myself," she replied, though she found herself hoping he would return. "Never doubted that for a minute," he said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "But a man's got to have a reason to come to town now and then." After he rode away, Madeline found herself standing in her doorway longer than necessary, watching the horizon long after he'd disappeared from view. True to his word, Fletcher returned a week later. This time there was no blood, just a bouquet of wildflowers and a request to escort her to the Sunday social. "I'm not much for dancing," he admitted, "but I'd be honored if you'd accompany me." The social was the talk of Redemption Creek for weeks afterward, not for the usual reasons of who danced with whom or Mrs. Henderson's questionable punch, but because Fletcher Morgan, the solitary rancher who rarely came to town, had eyes only for Madeline Barrett. "He looks at you like you're water in the desert," observed Ruth Thompson, Madeline's closest friend in town, as they watched Fletcher fetch them refreshments. "Don't be dramatic," Madeline chided, though she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever those blue eyes found hers across the room. "I'm just saying, in all my years, I've never seen a man so completely smitten," Ruth continued, "and after just a few weeks of knowing you." "It's not like that," Madeline protested weakly. "Oh, then why has he visited your shop 3 times this week alone?" Ruth raised an eyebrow knowingly. Madeline couldn't answer that, just as she couldn't explain the growing anticipation she felt each time the bell above her shop door announced his arrival. Over the next month, Fletcher's visits became regular, sometimes bringing her small gifts like a book of poetry or fresh eggs from his farm. Other times just stopping by to ensure she was safe. The threat of the Blackwell Gang still loomed over the territory, with reports of their activities growing increasingly concerning. "Why do you insist on confronting them?" Madeline asked one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. It's not just your fight. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, skipping a stone across the water's surface. Before I came here, I was a U.S. Marshal in Kansas. Saw a lot of men like Blackwell men who take what they want and destroy anything in their path. You were a lawman? She asked, surprised by this revelation. He nodded. For 7 years after the war, hung up my badge after. He hesitated, pain flashing across his features. After losing my partner to men like Blackwell, thought I could leave that life behind, start fresh with just me and my cattle. But you couldn't, she said softly, understanding dawning. Some fights find you no matter how far you run, he agreed. And I've never been one to stand aside when innocent people are threatened. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Fletcher instinctively placed himself between Madeline and the potential threat, his hand moving to his sidearm. It was young Billy Cooper, one of the ranch hands from the Thompsons' spread. "Mr. Morgan," he called, reining in his horse hard, "there's trouble." The Blackwell Gang hit the Stevens place, burned the barn, stole livestock. Mr. Stevens was shot when he tried to stop them. Fletcher's expression hardened. "Is he alive?" "Yes, sir. Doc Simmons is with him now, but they said," Billy swallowed hard, "they said they're coming for you next." "Left a warning nailed to the Stevens door with your name on it." Madeline felt her blood run cold. "Fletcher." He turned to her, his face set in grim determination. "Get back to town, stay in your shop." "You can't face them alone," she protested. "I won't be alone," Fletcher assured her. "The ranchers have been preparing. We knew this day would come." As Fletcher and Billy rode away, Madeline stood watching, fear gripping her heart. She had lost too many people in her life, her brother in the war, her father to consumption, her mother to grief. The thought of losing Fletcher now, when she had only just found him, was unbearable. That night, she paced her small apartment above the shop, jumping at every sound. When a soft knock came at her back door near midnight, she nearly cried with relief to find Fletcher standing there, unharmed. "You're all right," she breathed, pulling him inside. "We tracked them to their camp, but they'd already moved on," he explained, accepting the coffee she offered. "They're planning something big, Madeline, something soon." "Then leave," she urged, taking his hands in hers. "Both of us. We could go to California, start fresh." He looked down at their intertwined fingers, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I can't run, not from this, not again." "This isn't your responsibility," she argued. "It became my responsibility the moment I chose to stand up to them," he said softly. "Just as healing others became yours when you opened this shop." She knew he was right, even as she wished he wasn't. "Then what will you do?" "We're organizing a group ranchers, townspeople who can handle a gun. Sheriff Holloway's deputized a dozen men. Will be ready when they come." "And if you're not?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Instead of answering, Fletcher cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew those hands possessed. "You know, I rode into this town thinking I'd live out my days alone with my cattle and my memories. Then I stumbled into your shop, bleeding and half dead, and found something I thought I'd never have again." "What's that?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Hope," he said simply. And then his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of all the things they'd left unsaid: fear, longing, and a deepening affection that had grown between them like wildflowers after rain. When they parted, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I have to see this through, Madeline, but I promise you, I have every reason to come back alive." The next week passed in tense anticipation. The town prepared for conflict, with men patrolling the streets and families sending women and children to stay with relatives in safer territories. Madeline refused to leave, converting part of her shop into a makeshift infirmary. If there was to be fighting, there would be injuries, and she was determined to be ready. Fletcher visited daily, bringing her updates and stealing moments alone with her whenever possible. Their feelings for each other grew more evident to everyone in town, though neither had spoken of love yet, both perhaps afraid to name something so precious in the shadow of impending violence. The Blackwell Gang struck at dawn on a Tuesday, when the morning mist still clung to the valley. Madeline was awakened by gunfire and shouting in the streets. She dressed quickly, grabbing her medical bag and rushing downstairs to prepare for casualties. The battle for Redemption Creek lasted less than an hour but felt like an eternity. Madeline worked tirelessly, bandaging wounds and administering medicine, all while praying that Fletcher would not be among those brought to her with grave injuries. When the gunfire finally ceased, she stood in her doorway, scanning the street anxiously. Bodies lay where they had fallen, most wearing the distinct red bandanas of the Blackwell Gang. The townspeople had prevailed, but at what cost? Sheriff Holloway appeared, supporting a wounded deputy. "Madeline, we need you at the north end of town. Several men hurt bad." "Fletcher?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "Fighting like a demon last I saw," the sheriff replied. "That man's worth 10 ordinary gunmen." She gathered supplies and hurried toward the north end of Main Street, where the fighting had been heaviest. There she found several wounded men being tended in the street, but no sign of Fletcher. "Has anyone seen Mr. Morgan?" she asked repeatedly as she moved from patient to patient. It was young Billy Cooper who finally answered her. "Miss Barrett, he went after Blackwell himself. Tracked him toward the creek when he tried to escape." Madeline's heart nearly stopped. James Blackwell was notorious for his cruelty and skill with a gun. The thought of Fletcher facing him alone was terrifying. Despite protests from those around her, she handed her supplies to Ruth Thompson and ran toward the creek, her skirts gathered in her hands. The morning air was cool against her face as she followed the path she and Fletcher had walked so many times. The sound of a single gunshot broke the silence, echoing across the water. Madeline froze, then forced herself forward, her breath coming in short gasps as she rounded the bend in the creek. There, on the bank, 2 figures stood facing each other. One was Fletcher, still upright but listing slightly to one side. Across from him was a tall man in a black coat, Blackwell himself, his gun drawn but hanging limply at his side. As Madeline watched, Blackwell slowly crumpled to his knees, a red stain spreading across his chest. He toppled forward into the shallow water with a splash. Fletcher remained standing, his revolver still pointed where Blackwell had been. Only when Madeline called his name did he seem to register her presence. "Madeline," he turned, his face pale, "you shouldn't be here." She rushed to him, noticing then the blood seeping through his shirt. "You're hit." "It's nothing," he started to say, but his legs gave way beneath him. She caught him as best she could, easing him down onto the rocky shore. "Don't you dare die on me, Fletcher Morgan," she ordered, tearing open his shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his shoulder. It was bleeding freely but hadn't hit anything vital from what she could tell. "Not when we've only just begun." A weak smile touched his lips. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Barrett." She worked quickly, using the clean bandages she always carried in her pockets to stem the bleeding. "We need to get you back to town." "In a minute," he said, grasping her wrist with his bloodied hand. "Need to tell you something first." "It can wait," she insisted, worried by the growing pallor of his face. "No," he said firmly. "Learned long ago not to leave important things unsaid." He took a labored breath. "I love you, Madeline Barrett. Have since that first night when you cleaned the blood from my hands and told me they were already clean." Tears sprang to her eyes as she pressed the bandage more firmly against his wound. "You pick the most inconvenient times to be romantic, Fletcher Morgan." "Part of my charm," he replied with a weak chuckle that turned into a grimace. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "So you have to live, you understand? You have to live so we can build something together." His eyes held hers, bright with pain but also with determination. "Yes, madam." Help arrived in the form of Sheriff Holloway and 2 deputies, who carefully transported Fletcher back to town. Madeline refused to leave his side, directing them to bring him to her living quarters above the shop, rather than the overcrowded doctor's office. For 3 days, Fletcher hovered between life and death, fever gripping him as infection set in. Madeline barely slept, applying fresh poultices and cool compresses, whispering promises and sometimes prayers when she thought he couldn't hear. On the fourth day, his fever broke. When he opened his eyes, clear and lucid for the first time in days, Madeline was dozing in a chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. She startled awake, joy flooding her tired face. "Of course I stayed. Someone had to make sure you kept your promise to live." As Fletcher recovered, news spread throughout the territory of how Redemption Creek had stood against the Blackwell Gang and won. With their leader dead, and most of the gang either killed or captured, the threat that had loomed over the region for so long was finally eliminated. Fletcher became something of a reluctant hero, though he insisted he'd done nothing that any other man wouldn't have done to protect their home and people they cared about. "I wasn't even supposed to be here," he confessed to Madeline one evening as they sat on the porch of her shop, watching the sunset. His arm was still in a sling, but he was growing stronger each day. "Redemption Creek was just a place to pass through on my way further west. What made you stay?" She asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. At first, good grazing land for cattle, friendly enough folks who didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. He turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the fading light. "Then I had a much better reason to put down roots." By the time autumn painted the surrounding mountains in gold and crimson, Fletcher had fully recovered, and Redemption Creek had returned to its peaceful routine. The events of that bloody summer were not forgotten, but life continued as it always did on the frontier, with determination and hope for better days ahead. Fletcher sold his small ranch and bought a property closer to town, a pretty piece of land with a view of the mountains, and just a 15-minute ride to Madeline's shop. Together, they designed a house with a wide wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for the family they both hoped to have. On a crisp October day, with the aspen leaves shimmering like gold coins in the breeze, Fletcher and Madeline were married in the small white church in Redemption Creek. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that matched his eyes, and he wore a new suit that made him look more handsome than any man had a right to be, according to Ruth Thompson's whispered commentary. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Holloway commented at the reception. Fletcher Morgan, the loneliest rancher in the territory, smiling like he's won the greatest prize in the world. "I have," Fletcher replied simply, his gaze finding Madeline across the room where she was speaking with some of the townswomen. As tradition dictated, the newlyweds were escorted to their new home by a procession of well-wishers, who left them at the front door with good-natured teasing and heartfelt congratulations. Once alone, Fletcher swept Madeline into his arms, carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests about his recently healed shoulder. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, setting her down gently in their new home, "welcome to the rest of our lives." The years that followed were not without challenges. The Montana Territory was still a wild place, with harsh winters and the constant work required to maintain a ranch. But Fletcher and Madeline faced each challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Madeline's mother, arrived the following autumn, a strong, healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later came a son, James, named for Fletcher's father. The house that had once seemed too large gradually filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life. Fletcher expanded his ranch operations, eventually becoming one of the most respected cattlemen in the territory. Madeline continued her work at the apothecary, training several young women in the healing arts and establishing a proper clinic as the town grew. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Fletcher surprised Madeline with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always dreamed of visiting. They left the children in the capable hands of Ruth Thompson and her husband, boarding the newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad for the journey west. San Francisco dazzled them with its cosmopolitan energy and breathtaking views of the bay. They attended the opera, dined in fine restaurants, and walked along the waterfront hand in hand like the young lovers they still were at heart. On their final night in the city, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room watching the lights reflect on the water, Fletcher wrapped his arms around Madeline from behind. "Happy?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. She leaned back into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible. Even though you married a man with blood on his hands," he asked, a trace of the old darkness creeping into his voice. Madeline turned in his arms to face him. "I married a man who was willing to get blood on his hands to protect others. There's a difference." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 5 years of laughter had begun to etch around his eyes. "And I told you then what I still believe now, those hands were already clean." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "How did I get so lucky finding you?" "I believe you stumbled through my back door bleeding all over my floor," she reminded him with a smile. "Not exactly the stuff of romantic legends." "I disagree," he countered. "I think it's the perfect beginning to our story. I came to you broken, and you made me whole again." When they returned to Redemption Creek, they found the town abuzz with news Montana had finally been granted statehood. The celebration lasted for days, with Fletcher and Madeline at the center of the festivities as respected members of the community. As the years passed, Redemption Creek grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community. The railroad brought new settlers, businesses flourished, and the wild uncertainty of the early days gave way to the stability of established civilization. Fletcher and Madeline's children grew tall and strong, with Elizabeth showing a keen interest in medicine like her mother, while James seemed born to the saddle, spending every possible moment working alongside his father on the ranch. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher presented Madeline with a journal bound in soft leather. Inside, he had written their story from that first bloody night in her shop to the present day. "So our grandchildren will know where they came from," he explained as she turned the pages, tears gathering in her eyes at the sight of his careful handwriting recording their shared history. "I never imagined this life," she admitted, looking up at the man who had changed everything for her. "When I came to Redemption Creek, I was just looking for a quiet place to practice my healing. I never expected to find a love like this." Fletcher gathered her close. "That makes two of us. I came here running from my past and instead found my future." In the spring of their 15th year together, when Elizabeth was preparing to leave for medical school in Denver, and James had taken on more responsibility at the ranch, Madeline discovered she was expecting again a surprise that filled their home with renewed joy and anticipation. "Are we too old for this?" she wondered aloud one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains that had become so familiar over the years. Fletcher's hand rested protectively over the swell of her abdomen. "Too old for another miracle? Never." Their youngest child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived as winter's first snow dusted the mountains. She was the image of her mother, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "She's going to be a handful," Fletcher predicted, cradling his newborn daughter with the confidence of a man who'd had years of practice. "Like her father," Madeline replied with a knowing smile. As Redemption Creek entered the new century, the Morgan family stood as living testament to the power of redemption and love's ability to heal even the deepest wounds. Fletcher, whose hands had once been stained with blood shed in defense of the innocent, now used those same hands to build, to comfort, to nurture the family and community he had come to cherish. On the occasion of their 25th wedding anniversary, the town of Redemption Creek held a celebration in their honor. Former Sheriff Holloway, now white-haired but still robust, raised a toast to the couple who had become the heart of the community. "To Fletcher and Madeline Morgan," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowded town square. "Two people who remind us all that even in the darkest times, love finds a way, and that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness." Later that night, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, Fletcher took Madeline's hand in his, the same hand she had washed clean of blood all those years ago. 25 years, he marveled. Did you think we'd make it this far when you were patching up that surly, bleeding cowboy? I knew you were trouble from the moment you fell through my door, she teased. But yes, even then, there was something about you that made me think you might be worth the effort. Just might be, he asked with mock offense. She stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. At 50, Madeline was still beautiful, the silver threading through her dark hair only adding to her elegance. No, she corrected softly. Even then, I think I knew you were the one man worth risking my heart for. Fletcher pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been when he was younger. I love you, Madeline Morgan, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow. Such poetry from a cattle rancher, she murmured against his chest. Only for you, he promised. Only ever for you. As they continued home, arm in arm beneath the vast Montana sky, both reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from blood and violence to peace and prosperity, from strangers to the deepest of loves. Their story, like the West itself, was one of transformation of hands once stained with blood now clean through love's redemptive power, of a small frontier town that had grown into a community, of two souls who had found in each other the healing they both desperately needed. And as the lights of their home came into view, with its wide porch and windows glowing with welcome, Fletcher and Madeline knew that the greatest adventure of all had been the life they'd built together, a life that would continue to unfold with each sunrise, each season, each year they were blessed to share. For in Redemption Creek, as in their hearts, the frontier had been tamed not by force, but by love, a love that had begun with bloody hands made clean and grown into a legacy that would endure long after the wild days of the West had faded into legend.